A reading from the book of Acts, chapter 9, verses 36 through 43. Listen for a good word from the Lord. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in the upstairs room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. And this became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I was in my first year at a new church after graduating from seminary. I'd actually only been on the job for a couple of months. I got the call early on a Saturday morning. Our associate music minister, who was also our music minister's wife, who had also been battling cancer for a long time, had passed away. Our pastor, one of their good friends as well, was out of town. So the children's minister and I met up and rode over there together to their house to ensure that there was a ministerial presence with the family and with those who would gather. The scene was like so many we would recognize if we have ever been present in the wake of a death. The family was loved by many. She had been an incredible influence on multiple churches and a friend to many. She had directed the children's choirs at those churches and taught many of the kids to play piano. Everyone always spoke lovingly of her. Even her husband used to joke that he rode on his wife's coattails throughout much of his career. Again, it was like what you would expect. People were coming and going as they were able. Hugs and tears were overflowing, all full of compassion and obvious grief. Some were full of relief even that her pain was finally at an end. When we made it into the house, the first thing I noticed was the dining room table. It was covered. There were Bibles and hymnals, her favorite pieces of music, but what stood out most were the pictures. I don't know if they had been there for some time, as it had become clear that she was nearing her end, or if it was just something that her husband and daughters did right after she passed away. It looked as if they had emptied every photo album in the house. There were pictures of their family on holidays, on special vacations. There were special candid shots of her as a mother holding her children, the kind that are really closest to a mother's heart, I would think. There were ones of her at different ages that had likely been passed down from her parents, and they had kept them and loved them. There were photos of her and her husband on their wedding day and at different points throughout their life together. And there was evidence as well of an incredible ministry. There were images of her at the church piano, proclaiming God's praise with her talents. There were images of her leading the children's choirs, drawing the best out of them and teaching them what it means to worship with their full voice. The entire scene was beautiful. It was as if it was a makeshift monument to her life and to her work. I guess that's what we do when someone dies, isn't it? We pull out the things that help us remember who they were. Sometimes they are right there within reach, things that everyone knew about. Then others come from the very back of the closet. They take us by surprise even, and they make us smile. Yep, we say, that was her. I wonder if we've been acting like this in some way throughout our existence, grieving in this way as humans, holding on to the memory of those we lost. We say, I can't believe she's actually gone. That's the kind of scene that we're drawn into in the first century Joppa in the 9th chapter of the book of Acts. Luke tells us that a disciple named Tabitha has died. She's also known as Dorcas. One name is Aramaic Hebrew. It would have been spoken by her community that rooted itself on the worship and way of Jesus. The other is a Greek name. Both names mean gazelle. The fact that Luke tells us both versions of her name means that she is known outside of the Christian community in her hometown and region. She's known throughout the wider community. Her reputation precedes her, and she is beloved by all. Luke tells us more than her name, though. That would be significant enough. Outside of the main characters in the narrative, we don't often learn people's names. We learn their afflictions that Jesus healed, or the role that they tend to play in society, but Luke tells us how she was known throughout the community. He also tells us that she was a disciple. That's significant as well. I believe this may actually be the only time in the New Testament that the female version of the word disciple is actually used. So Luke does it on purpose. She was a follower of the way of Jesus, and it was clear to everyone to see. She became an imitator of Christ. This was seen in many ways, I'm sure, but especially in the way that she was known to be devoted to good works and to charity. A literal translation might say, she was full of good deeds and alms, which she continually did. She was constantly giving of herself to others. Now, there are some possible conclusions that we can draw about Tabitha or Dorcas based on the way that Luke talks about her. She was a woman of great talent, that's for sure. She was a seamstress of sorts. She made clothes. In order to have the means to pay for the fabric and the materials she would need, she likely was a woman of means as well. But she was different from what they would have expected with people of wealth and means, especially outside of the Christian community at the time. She didn't hoard her resources for herself. She used them to benefit others. Specifically, she used what she had and who she was to care for the widows. Perhaps she was a widow herself. Her husband isn't mentioned. Maybe that's because he died too. Maybe she knew how scary it was to suddenly find yourself without options in that time, without protection. Maybe she didn't want that for anyone else. So she had a heart for widows. It was the widows that Luke tells us were holding vigil for her. It was the widows who wept most bitterly for her loss. She had cared for them when they were at their most vulnerable. She clothed them when they had no clothes of their own. She kept them warm when they were cold. She provided for them, and they were so grateful that they couldn't help but show off the garments she had made as they wept for her. Peter, the apostle, it tells us, was at Lydda, pretty close to Joppa. When Tabitha died, they sent word and asked him to come. Now, I'm not sure what they expected to happen. Maybe it was all implied. Maybe there was a chance that they had heard about the healings that he had performed. Maybe they remembered that he was present when Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus from the dead. Maybe that story had been told, and maybe they thought there was a chance, however remote, that he could give them their friend and caregiver back. Maybe it wasn't that, though. Maybe they just wanted him to be there. Someone thought about how much Tabitha had given to the community around her. They thought about how much they had recognized the love and presence of Jesus in the way that she lived her life. And wouldn't it be appropriate for someone like Peter to preside at her funeral? Peter came. Maybe he too thought about the power that he had seen at work around him and even through him in ways he didn't expect. Maybe he thought back to the time when he and James and John had been with Jesus, when Jesus sent everyone out of that little girl's room. Maybe he remembered the prayers. Maybe he remembered the instruction Jesus offered to the girl, Talitha cum, little girl, get up, rise. And maybe, just maybe, he sent everyone away. He fell down to his knees and he prayed. But what exactly did he pray? We don't know. But his prayers were answered. All of their prayers were answered. Tabitha, get up, he said. And she did. She was given back to the community she loved and that loved her. She was able to bear witness to the way of Jesus again in both word and deed. She could be an even greater example of what it means to be a disciple now. Some might say that the miracle in this story is the fact that someone who was dead came back to life. A loved one taken from a community was given back to them, and we'd be right in thinking that. So often these miracles and these events, whether enacted by Jesus or the disciples or one of the prophets, they grant us signs of God's power breaking into our world. They are signs of what life will be like when God's will is finally done on earth as it is in heaven. They are miracles. It is no less miraculous, however, that Tabitha lived the way she did, caring for those she cared for, leaving behind a legacy of those who were lifted up because of her good works and acts of charity that she constantly did. As you read through parts of the books of Acts, And as you discover the life that people choose to live because of their faith in Jesus, it is almost as if they said to one another, we now know, because of Jesus, that God can do anything. God raised Jesus from the dead, so God can do everything. And eventually, God will finally have God's way on the entire earth. God's kingdom will at last come in ways we can't even imagine. And if watching Jesus and hearing about what he did teaches us anything, it is that things that will be different in that kingdom than they are right now. Roles will be reversed. Those who've been left out will be lifted up. The poor will be taken care of. No one will hurt or be taken advantage of. Everyone will be recognized as the child of God that they are. All needs will be provided for. No one will go hungry. No one will be thirsty. No widow or orphan will shiver in the cold because they have no clothing or housing. But why should we wait for that day to come? Why don't we live that way now? As if God's kingdom was already here now. It's as if they said to each other, let's take care of each other that way now. Think of the difference that could make. What if that were our legacy and the legacy of all people who said they followed Jesus? That message seems to have clearly sunk in with Tabitha. It has sunk in with all those like her who find themselves so wrapped up in the way of Jesus that they lovingly live as if his kingdom were already here now. They become signs of its inbreaking, just like Tabitha, who was dead but lived again. They leave a legacy of lives that are impacted for good. I think about this sometimes when I lead funerals. What we celebrate most about who the deceased was is how they impacted us and impacted others. What preaches most profoundly is when someone's life has been so impactful that the light and love of Jesus shone right through it. And if it is true, and I mean really true, and not simply embellished by a preacher trying to make a deceased sound good, you can look out into the congregation of mourners and you can see it on their faces. Their eyes brighten, they smile, they nod their heads, they look at each other knowingly and in agreement as if to say, yep, that was her. When we get to the graveside and we participate in the committal of the body to the ground, one of the final words I almost always say is very traditional for that moment. I recall that message from Revelation 14 where it says, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord henceforth. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, for they will rest from their labors, and their deeds follow them." And I continue in a familiar benediction by saying, "And so shall it be for our sister in Christ. The Lord bless her and keep her. The Lord make his face to shine upon her. The Lord lift up his countenance upon her and give her peace." Their deeds follow them. It's a reminder to us that the impact that the one we are burying will continue to be felt in us. It's also a challenge to those of us who remain as well. Ours is not a works-based faith. It is a grace-based faith. Salvation is given freely to all regardless of circumstance and action, but a response is required of us that we live out our faith in ways that impact this world and make it better. Like Tabitha, we are called to live as if God's kingdom had already come so that the rest of the world can get a taste of it through us. No, we may never witness or facilitate a resurrection like Peter did, but it's clear that Jesus wants us to follow him and imitate him. Jesus wants us to do what he did, like Tabitha did, and he wants us to do it each day. Paul's letter to the Ephesians reminds us by saying, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." Tabitha was known as a disciple, a follower of Jesus, because she imitated him in love and service to others. We can be known that way as well. And we have seen it in so many others, especially those who have cared for us and loved us like a mother. And in so doing, they have shown us the way of faith. I read this week about a woman named Becky O'Connell who's been given a unique unofficial title by her community. She's known as the Baby Whisperer. Officially, this 65-year-old woman was a temporary foster care worker. According to an article that came out about her in the Chicago Tribune, she keeps baby clothes arranged in size in a guest room, and hand-knit caps are stacked on a table near the door. The white wicker basket is always within reach. She's always prepared because at any moment of the day or night, she could receive a call from a social worker who needs a place for an infant to go in her care. Some of the children have been abandoned. Others have been abused. All of them are desperate for love, for touch, for attention. So far, Ms. O'Connell has taken in 77 infants, about 7 babies per year that stay from 1 night to 4 months. Now, the road to this unique calling wasn't easy. In 1999, her youngest son, Ian, was killed in a car accident. For years after his death, she says that she couldn't even concentrate. She says she looked and acted like a normal person, but nothing makes you feel normal after something like that. A few years later, as she was just beginning to regain her balance, she says she read an ad for a local adoption agency. They needed someone to be a temporary foster care parent for newborns. To Becky O'Connell, who had always loved babies, it sounded like a dream job. I'd say because of her experience, it might have even been a calling. She has a secret, she says. It's simply giving each child her undivided attention. She adds that people think that babies bring a lot of disorder and confusion to a household, but I'm here to tell you it's not the babies who are disordered and confused. She says it's the adults. My job, she says, is just to fall in love with those babies. I read another story. The Australian Christian author and speaker John Dickson came to follow the way of Jesus through the faithful witness of an ordinary, middle-aged mother figure in his life named Glenda. Glenda used to teach a Bible class at his school, but a group of their classmates ended up gathering at her house on Friday afternoons for lunch and honest conversation about Jesus, even beyond the classroom. They might have come for the food and the conversation, but eventually, he says, that the true Jesus stuff became as important as anything else. No matter who they were, and especially what they had done, Glenda opened her heart to every one of them on those Friday afternoons as if they were family. There was one night that one of Dixon's friends, a man named Daniel, had become rather intoxicated during one of their weekend parties. They didn't think they could take him home. His dad was in the army, and they knew that he would be livid and strict. They couldn't leave him on the street either. They were trying to figure out where they should take him when someone said, "Let's take him to Glenda's house. She'll have him. She'll clean him up." It was close to midnight when they knocked on the door, and it turned out she was having a grand dinner party with lots of guests. But miraculously, or just true to who she was, she didn't bat an eye. She welcomed them all in. She showed them straight past her guests into the back of the house. She got some spare clothes and instructed them to clean him up and just put him to bed. When they came back to pick him up the next morning, he was sitting at Glenda's kitchen table. She was making him bacon and eggs, and they were just chatting away. It wasn't just her faithful lessons and testimony that left an impact on them. It was the way she lived it out, welcoming all people, imitating Jesus as if God's kingdom was breaking through right then and there. We would call the Tabithas, the Becky O'Connells, the Glendas of this world many things. They certainly were disciples. In many traditions of the church, we would call them mothers. Maya Angelou said, family isn't always blood, it's the people in your life who want you in theirs, the ones who accept you for who you are, the ones who would do anything to see you smile and who love you no matter what. So regardless of the biological or legal relationship, they offer care in the name of Christ that shapes us. They leave a legacy, and their deeds follow them until they at last find rest in the arms of the one who redeemed them and showed them a way. We all have people like that in our lives. They are our mothers. And thanks be to God for mothers like that. Amen.